Happy Halloween, metalheads of the internet! I'm a hot dog, and today we're going to talk about 10 great bands that blend horror and metal together. But before we do that, just another little reminder, just a little heads up, that the Metal Meltdown's very special Halloween party goes down this Sunday, October 29th, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We're gonna play video games, we're gonna drink, we're gonna do some goofy shit. It's consistently the biggest party of the year here on the Metal Meltdown because we here at the Metal Meltdown love Halloween. And we're so excited to celebrate once again with you, and you, and you. You not so much. Move aside. You, however, you gotta be there. It ain't a party without you, bro. I may or may not have had more than just the shot that you saw on screen. I also may or may not be sweating like a fucking whore in church in this thing. God damn. So today we're going to talk about some great metal bands that blend horror and metal together. To be clear, metal and horror have always had a very close, symbiotic relationship, contrary to the belief of the Ice Nine Kills fan base. They did not single-handedly invent the idea of metal and horror being together. There are plenty of bands who write pretty horrific shit and are inspired by horror movies, and on the flip side, there's also plenty of horror that is influenced by metal and also is objectively pretty metal. But there are some bands that take things just a step further and blend metal and horror into something truly disgusting, creepy, unnerving, and those are the bands we're going to talk about today. Not Ice Nine Kills, though. Once again, cannot stress this enough. Contrary to what some of you would like to think, Ice Nine Kills did not invent horror and metal being together, alright? For the love of God, listen to more music, please. This is not a ranked or numbered list. We're not really talking about any of these bands in any particular order. That being said, we will talk about some of the bigger names, some of the more easily, instantly recognizable names first. And with that in mind, it doesn't get much more bigger, it doesn't get much more iconic than Black fucking Sabbath. The forefathers of heavy metal music, the men who paved the way for Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Metallica, Motorhead, Megadeth, Slayer, and all these other bands and all these other subgenres. Turns out they were a bunch of horror nerds. The name Black Sabbath itself comes from a Boris Karloff film of the same name. Tony Iommi has specifically cited Christopher Lee and a lot of the horror films that he was a part of as an influence on Black Sabbath. As Rolling Stone recounts, in a 2013 promotional video for one of Christopher Lee's own albums, he told Iommi, "You are the father of metal." To which the guitarist replied, "But you're the one that started it really, because we used to go watch Dracula and the horror films that you did, and that's what influenced us." Black Sabbath kind of invented, sonic horror in general, too. The way they tuned their guitars, the way they brought in, jazz and the blues and made it darker and heavier and more metallic. Records like Paranoid, Masters of Reality, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath are all filled with intricate, dark songcraft and songwriting, emotive performances from everyone in the gang. And of course, most notably, their debut album is genuinely still creepy to this very day. In fact, the song Black Sabbath itself genuinely puts a chill down my spine. From Ozzy's, incredible vocal performance, maybe one of the best of his entire career, to be honest, to the use of, samples and the Devil's Tritone, that whole song just sounds like somebody opening the gates of hell and giving up on life. The forefathers of metal, also simultaneously the first to bring metal and horror together. Go figure. Here's another band that does a great job at bringing horror and metal together. King Diamond. And in this instance, we're kind of talking about King Diamond the man and his body of work, and not just King Diamond the band. Because before there was King Diamond the band, there was Merciful Fate the band, and they too were kind of spooky and kind of creepy. Everything about them, visually, musically, conceptually, paved the way for a lot of what would continue to kind of blossom and emerge throughout the 80s in thrash metal, black metal, speed metal. But more specifically, the King Diamond band, with the man King Diamond himself at the helm, took things even further by basically making every album sound like a haunted house come to life. with the way that vocals were put together, and synthesizers and guitars, and the way that the stories were constructed, and the way that the lyrics were presented and delivered. Hell, in the case of Abigail, the idea of bringing a haunted house to life was extremely literal. So much so that I would have no issue playing material from that album at an actual haunted house. I actually feel like it would fit the mood quite well. In this scenario, though, where I'm DJing a haunted house, I don't think I'm wearing the hot dog suit, because I'm very warm and very sweaty in this. Plus, hot dogs aren't very scary. I mean, I guess they are if you're a vegan, or if you're like a health nut, but I don't know, in general, nah. That very literal haunted house feel also translates to his live show. I've seen King Diamond twice, once in 2013 and once in 2015, and in both instances, the stage was set up to look like an old abandoned mansion adorned with like moss and like gargoyles and stained glass windows, and he had all these characters pop up on stage and do these little skits, and there were monsters, and it was just generally quite spooky. It's more silly spooky, but spooky nonetheless. It fits the vibe of what we're going for in this video. Next up, Rob Zombie. And much like before, I want to emphasize that we're not really talking about just Rob Zombie the band, but also Rob Zombie the man and his vast body of work. Before going solo, Rob Zombie was the lead singer of White Zombie, and they initially started off as like a noise rock, alt rock kind of band before then transitioning into like industrial metal, groove metal, and they definitely had some like spooky, eerie cuts here and there. Rob Zombie, the band, however, takes things a step further. There is classic horror influence and atmosphere dripping all over his albums, and granted, sometimes it turns into like B-movie style horror, and it gets very over the top, and there's like sci-fi and psychedelic shit also happening at the same time, but like, it's still there. It's expanding the atmosphere of Rob Zombie's particular brand of horror. I mean, stuff like Super Beast, Dragula, More Human Than Human, I mean, they belong on any and every Halloween playlist, in my opinion. Rob Zombie also gets bonus points here for being a horror movie filmmaker himself, having directed stuff like The Devil's Rejects, House of a Thousand Corpses, The Lords of Salem, and even the Halloween remakes from the late 2000s going into the early 2010s before they kind of like rebooted it all for like the third or fourth time. I don't know, the Halloween series doesn't make a ton of sense. For the record, these movies aren't even like great in my opinion. Like, Rob Zombie is a ferociously unsubtle person, and that works for his brand of over-the-top, spooky, corny Halloween party rock, but maybe not so much for, like, a serious, dramatic, like, violent slasher horror film. But hey, bonus points are bonus points, and there's no denying that Rob Zombie is definitely somebody who has blended horror and metal into something that is very much his own. Next up, we have Portal. This should be a pretty unsurprising addition to this list, to this video, because Portal are objectively pretty fucking horrifying. They write weird, twisted, unorthodox, obtuse, avant-garde, experimental metal, like blackened death metal with all these weird elements, and it's noisy and chaotic and unhinged, and it creates a very like claustrophobic and consuming atmosphere. Records like Swerve, Vexavoid, Ion, Avow, and Hagbulbia, they're legitimately pretty horrifying. Decibel Magazine once wrote, "If Morbid Angel and Goreguts had birthed a German expressionist child, that unholy creature would be Portal." And honestly, I agree 110% with that. So much so that I probably could have just said that and you would have gotten it, and I could have, like, we could have moved on to the next band. Portal's entire goal, at least according to the masked anonymous guitarist Horror Elegium, is to capture a cinematic horror scope, and they have consistently achieved that across the board. It's not even worth debating or arguing. They're just straight up fucking scary. Next up, we have Blood O Snork, a French avant-garde, experimental, like black metal, industrial metal kind of band. Much like Portal, they are responsible for creating some genuinely sick and twisted and terrifying stuff on recent albums. They have pulled heavy influence from Lovecraftian literature. Disharmonium Undreamable Abysses from 2022 was, in my opinion, one of the best albums released that year, definitely the scariest, and while I wasn't like a massive fan of its follow-up, Nahab, I do still think it's a pretty like garish and gnarly collection of horrific black metal jams. I mean, everything they've done is just, like, fucked in the head. You have the 777 trilogy, The Work Which Transforms God, the Memoria Vestura album series. Like, they're just really great at creating these, like, immersive, unorthodox, atmospheric, dissonant sounds and layers, and blending all of that into, like, some really ferocious and cold and monstrous, like, avant-garde black metal. If you ain't even a little bit scared listening to Blood O Snork, you're either A, lying, or you have literal, not figurative, but literal, balls of steel. Next up, we have Acid Witch, arguably the definitive Halloween metal band, I would dare say. They only drop albums around Halloween. All of their music is usually centered around Halloween. If it isn't, it's centered on spooky nonsense and serial killers and, like, real-life tragedy and horror, and also, like, cartoonish comic book-esque horror as well. They just totally embody the Halloween spirit and all kinds of horror, and they channel it through, like, doom metal, death doom, stoner metal. There's a lot of distortion, there are a lot of samples, there's a lot of, like, psychedelic elements and textures thrown into the mix as well. They are so into and committed to, like, Halloween and horror and metal that they have unironically dubbed themselves Halloween metal. If any band out there dared to call themselves a Halloween metal band, Acid Witch just makes the most sense, honestly. I may or may not have also unironically played Acid Witch, like, back when I lived in Mississauga, and, like, kids would come through trick-or-treating, and, like, I've unironically jammed Acid Witch, because I just thought it fit the mood, like, that well. I think I remember one year I dressed up as, like, I had, like, a chef uniform that I covered in blood, and a fake machete, and my buddy Moose was dressed up with, like, fucking, like, he had, like, a weird, like, ultra-realistic pig mask and, like, a leather bodysuit. It was really creepy. But, like, we would just hack up, like, fake meat, and, you know, we would play, like, Acid Witch, and, like, my hair was, like, long and curly, and it just draped down over my face. It was great. All the kids were so fucking scared. It was awesome. Next up, we have The Lion's Daughter, and if you know anything about this channel, then the inclusion of The Lion's Daughter should not be too surprising. In their early years, they played some really oppressive, misanthropic, like, blackened sludge metal. In more recent years, especially from Future Cult onwards, they have introduced, like, synth work into their stuff. They've gone into more industrial and alternative metal territory. Their most recent album, Bathhouse, was influenced heavily by, like, a lot of, like, grotesque body horror, and it went further into, like, death and black metal territory. And it was a really just sickening record. I mean, you had these really heavy, hype as fuck industrial synth pop beats, like something you might have heard from, like, Nine Inch Nails in their very early years, and then you'd have, like, some really aggressive, muscular metal riffage, and there'd be samples and all this other weird, crazy shit. That album's awesome. It's one of my favorites of this year. Their previous album, Skin Show, is pretty malicious and evil, too. It has been described by the band as kind of like a culmination of, like, everything gross and fucked up about, like, Times Square in the 70s, and, like, it brings in, like, all this other kind of, like, horror influence. The song Neon Teeth even kind of brings in some Exorcist-style keyboard and synth work and kind of warps that around to some really catchy and moody kind of, like, alternative and doom metal. Yeah, the Lion's Daughters guys are pretty fucked in the head. I would say of all the bands we're talking about today, at least some of these newer ones and less big-name ones, they probably do the best at bringing together horror and metal in, like, a really unique and exhilarating way. Next up, we have Devil Master, another favorite here at the Metal Meltdown. I've always loved the way that they've blended, like, black metal and all these different shades and varieties of black metal with, like, Japanese punk music and death rock and gothic rock. I think there's something a little bit more cartoonishly horrific about Devil Master in comparison to, say, Portal, Blood O Snork, Lion's Daughter, but I also wouldn't say that this is, like, haunted house music in the vein of, like, King Diamond. I think that they're very flamboyant, and it kind of, like, fits, like, a more serious atmosphere and also a goofier, more tongue-in-cheek, relaxed kind of atmosphere simultaneously. And that's really great, in my opinion, because, I mean, Halloween can be both. It can be fun and goofy. Case in point, I'm a fucking hot dog right now. but can also be a little bit more serious and fucked up, and it can be like genuinely really scary if you want it to be. The way that Devilmaster are able to balance all of these tones and all of these atmospheres and influence, I think is genuinely really exciting. Plus, the music just fucking rips. Like, everything they've done is just fantastic. Probably some of the most exciting and interesting and unique stuff I've heard from, like, underground American black metal in a long time. Next up, we have Axslasher, a more relatively unknown pick. These guys actually don't even have a debut album to their name, just a bunch of EPs and singles and a live album. But they have so ferociously and passionately dedicated themselves to 80s horror camp and sleaze that it's just kind of difficult not to talk about them. To be clear, there are plenty of bands that just love Evil Dead and The Exorcist and will write songs about that until the end of time. In the case of Axslasher, though, they are so ferociously dedicated to Halloween and to 80s sleaze and camp and like the whole 80s horror vibe and scene that I can't help but genuinely wonder if all of their members are on the spectrum. Like, this is what they live for. At this point, they're more of a platform for promoting, like, 80s horror and B-movies and stuff like that than they are for, like, making music. Case in point, they don't even have, like, a full-blown debut album to their name. But, like, it's fun, and it works, and it's cool. Like, every time around Halloween, they'll do, like, movie marathons, and they'll talk about all kinds of different horror and all kinds of other fucked up shit. And when you listen to whatever little material they do have, that horror influence is just impossible to ignore as well. I mean, these guys are so in love with, like, old slasher flicks and old horror movies. It's fair to say that they're not really blending horror and metal. They're just, like, fucking obsessed. But they're so obsessed that in a way it's being blended in. You know? It's like an emulsification of horror and metal. And a fucking good one with that. I mean, if you don't emulsify, like, egg yolks and oil, you can't get mayonnaise. This is like horror metal mayonnaise. I don't know where I'm going with this fucking analogy or whatever, but hopefully, whatever. Moving on. Axslasher are cool. That's the point. With this in mind, let's start bringing things to a close, and let's talk about Italian death metal band Fulci, a band so committed to horror and metal that they named themselves after Italian filmmaker Lucio Fulci. And in fact, much of what they do is centered around his vast body of work and classic Italian horror cinema. The music is dark and brutal and morbid and fucked up. It pulls direct influence from a lot of what Fulci has done. It's got lots of monsters, and their most recent album, of the name of which I'm not immediately remembering, even went as far as to bring in like a lot of 80s synth stuff and like more atmospheric textures and songcraft, which made it feel like literally the soundtrack to something pulled from an 80s B-movie, albeit with death metal attached. Exhumed Information was the name of the albums. Thank you, Spotify. Also, all of that synth stuff was contributed by TV Crimes. Fun fact, that's cool, that's neat. They even did like a full-blown horror short film, Tropical Sun, which was pretty good. It was bloody and a little fucked up. It was cool. Alright, we're pretty much near the end of this thing. We're done. Those are 10 great bands that blend horror and metal. I'm gonna take a shower. I'm fucking dying here, man. Thank you for watching. Press subscribe. Halloween party. Blah blah blah. I'm taking this fucking thing off. I'm taking this fucking hot dog off. Ah! I feel free. I have shed my hot dog skin. I'm free at last.